It's a great honor for me to introduce Jamie Kalven tonight. His four-part exposé tells the story of a massive criminal enterprise rooted deep inside the Chicago Police Department. And his story is this. For more than a decade, Sergeant Ronald Watts was supposed to be enforcing the law inside housing projects on Chicago's South Side. Instead, the sergeant and his team extorted the wealthy few inside a deeply marginalized community. They protected drug dealers who paid them a so-called tax. They planted drugs on dealers who didn't cooperate, and they even organized the murder of 2 drug dealers who defied them. Sergeant Watts behaved with impunity, protected by a code of silence that blanketed his entire department. This ironclad silence endured for more than a decade, despite lengthy investigations into his conduct by the Drug Enforcement Agency, by Chicago Police's own Internal Affairs Unit, and the FBI itself. As the shakedown scheme continued, 2 Chicago police officers who had been tapped by the FBI to investigate themselves became victims. With approval from Chicago's most senior police officials, their identities got leaked. The 2 whistleblowers were labeled rats. They were humiliated and their careers destroyed. Then in 2013, one of these officers, Shannon Spaulding, reached out to Jamie. Now, Jamie is a very unusual person because he's both a veteran reporter, a veteran investigative reporter, and a human rights activist. He was a trusted figure inside the sprawling public housing complex where Shannon worked. In effect, Shannon and Jamie had been walking the identical beat for many, many years. But despite Jamie's huge advantages in reporting this story, he still faced equally huge obstacles. Jamie wanted to let the voices of the 2 whistleblowers carry the story. At the same time, he also wanted to honor the journalistic requirements of corroboration and fair comment. It says something about the commitment to integrity and accuracy that the Intercept and Jamie spent months fact-checking his story, word by word. Once published, the response to Jamie's work was fast and far-reaching. Spaulding and her partner shared a $2 million settlement. With several convictions already overturned, Jamie's now working with lawyers so that they can get group exoneration of the dozens of people ensnared by Sergeant Watts and his dirty team. In the end, Code of Silence illuminates how Chicago's dysfunctional cop culture worked to the extreme disadvantage of 2 sets of victims. The first group, of course, is obvious. They are the poorest Americans, consigned to public housing, and they inhabit an invisible human urban geography where basically they are just in a no man's land. They are invisible, and they're also written off as criminal. The second group is the police themselves. As Jamie has said to me, if police unions were really representing their members, they would help honest cops do their jobs. Instead, police unions enable and abet their most crooked outliers. In Jamie's view, police actually have to be heroic to the point of martyrdom to speak truth. And so, in the end, I think that what Jamie has done is something quite remarkable. He basically has exposed truth. In so doing, he has both helped expose the injustice, he's helped defeat injustice. And it's really quite something that one could actually spend 3 years and would have such commitment to accomplish this. So without further ado, over to Jamie.
The origins of the Code of Silence series go back more than 20 years to a time when I was working as an organizer and then as a journalist. in a high-rise public housing development on Chicago's South Side. In that abandoned place, a community criminalized by the war on drugs and destined to be obliterated by demolition, I daily witnessed abusive police practices ranging from verbal ugliness to corruption to grave human rights offenses. Over time, a question formed. How would the world have to be organized? What institutional conditions would have to exist for what I was observing from day to day to be the case, and for abusive officers to carry themselves with such an air of impunity? That question has animated my work ever since. I've pursued it as a journalist, and I've pursued it through litigation under the Freedom of Information Act. One result is a 2014 decision of the state appellate court holding that police misconduct files are public information in Illinois. As the wall of official secrecy came down, a flood of police disciplinary information was made public, yielding a statistical portrait of impunity. The CPD's own data reveals that only an infinitesimal number of citizen complaints result in meaningful discipline of officers. Despite the breakthrough with that decision, I continued to feel I hadn't done justice to the realities I'd observed on the ground. Long after the public housing high-rises had been demolished, after the scene of the crimes had disappeared, I carried a burden of unfinished business. Then Shannon Spaulding, an undercover narcotics officer, and her partner, Danny Echeverria, entered my life. They had an amazing story to tell, a story of massive police corruption enabled by racial inequality and insulated by institutional denial. It afforded the possibility of conducting a narrative biopsy of the underlying pathologies in the Chicago Police Department. Spaulding proved a remarkable source, not only because of her courage, which is somehow both fragile and robust, but also because of her ability to describe in telling detail various dynamics within the department. Among the most important lessons I've learned is that the Code of Silence is not only, as is commonly understood, a peer-to-peer phenomena of the rank and file in the trenches together. I've got your back, you've got mine. It's rather a mode of governance by high-ranking police officials, a set of tools for imposing and enforcing the official narrative. Under the present circumstances, to challenge that official narrative, as Spaulding and Echeverria did, is an act of self-sacrificial heroism. Knowing what it has cost them, I've emerged from this project with deepened sympathy for the working conditions of rank-and-file officers. Imagine working in an institution that demands you be divided from your best self as a condition of employment. Enduring police reform will only be achieved if it works for officers as well as the citizens they serve. I hope there is a competing union being organized out there on behalf of the rank and file. Finally, a word of thanks to editors Betsy Reed, Roger Hodge, and their colleagues at The Intercept. This was not an easy story to publish. The challenge was to investigate the Code of Silence without inadvertently aiding and abetting the Code of Silence by constantly recurring from graph to official denials. Together, we fashioned strategies for satisfying journalistic standards of rigor without muffling the voices of the whistleblowers. I gratefully share this award with them. Thank you.